Welcome to the Experimental Honesty podcast. I'm Brian Curtis. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Taya Cohen. Taya is a tenured associate professor of organizational behavior and business ethics at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business, and she holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. Her research focuses on honesty, ethical behavior, moral character, negotiation, and conflict management, and her work's been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, BBC, NPR, Time Magazine, and many other outlets. I've been reading Taya's work for a really long time now, and I consider her to be among the most creative and impactful honesty researchers in the world. So it was really an honor to be able to meet her last year at the initial Honesty Project Research Conference, and really great to get another opportunity to chat with her today about her life and ongoing work. You can learn more about Taya by searching her name online, which will bring up her Carnegie Mellon University webpage that has links for the Meaningful Work and Building an Ethical Future Forum that we chat a bit about in our conversation, and also her publications and other resources. You can also find Taya on Twitter by searching her username at 1TayaC. And as a reminder, the Experimental Honesty app is now officially available on the App Store and Google Play. If you're interested in learning and practicing some science-based skills to build a more honest and open and authentic life within a community of people like us who are interested in this stuff. So if you'd like, you can start your free 2-week trial of the app by going to experimentalhonesty.com. All right, let's talk to Taya.
More like a steel drum, but it's different. But it was actually, when my friend told me she was buying a drum, I was like, we don't need a drum. But it's actually pretty cool. It's a really nice sound. So.
Is it like I have over here, it's called a tongue drum, like a steel tongue drum, and it's just really amazing sounds, like doom, doom, doom.
It's a little different. It has the notes. I mean, it has like an octave and a half, and if you hit it, and it's marked on where you tap the mallet to get the different tones.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so I don't know if that's the same, but he started exploring it. I played the saxophone growing up.
Nice.
So yeah, not really anymore, but I'd like to get my kids into music. We'll see.
Yeah, I had so it went piano, and then in middle school it went trumpet, and then guitar and bass, but drums have been...
Drums is your thing.
Drums is the thing. All right, so I'm here with Dr. Taya Cohen. So Taya is a tenured associate professor of organizational behavior and business ethics at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business. You also hold a courtesy appointment in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. Your research focuses on honesty, ethical behavior, moral character, negotiation, conflict management, and you've been featured in a lot of cool places. So the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, BBC, NPR, Time Magazine, and then the pinnacle of your career, talking with me right now.
Happy to be here on the Experimental Honesty podcast.
There you go. Well, thanks so much for taking the time, though. It really does mean a lot.
It's a pleasure.
Yes. So when I was interviewing Emma, right, Dr. Levine, she initially wanted to be president of the United States. Okay, so it turns out she didn't always want to go into honesty research. So I'm typically curious, like how, from where you started, how you kind of think about your trajectory getting to where you are focused on, these topics that we just mentioned. How did that progress for you?
Yeah, I did not have ambitions of being president of the United States. Still don't. Maybe Emma will eventually do that. She'd be a fantastic president. It's interesting looking back and, from where I am today and seeing these threads through my life. I certainly have gravitated toward psychology for a long time. My mother is a school psychologist, child psychologist, so there was always books around the house growing up that I would read about, interesting things related to people and psychology. So that's been an ongoing interest of mine. I knew also early on that I did not want to go into anything clinical, and that wasn't interest, but I was interested in research. And when I was in high school, I actually wrote my first research paper. It was on schizophrenia, I think, on causes of schizophrenia. And the family story is that I said when I finished that assignment, I said, I would do this just for fun. So I really enjoyed research, and especially research in psychology. A friend of mine who I knew in elementary school even remembers that she said I wanted to be a college professor when I was really young. How I got that idea, I don't know. But certainly the theme of research has been an enduring one. And about honesty in particular, I don't know that I would have known I would go into studying honesty, but I've always been a direct communicator and did not and still don't really shy away from conflict and stating what I think. So there's probably a theme and a thread there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, so you did social psychology, right?
Yeah. So my PhD is in social psychology from the University of North Carolina. I did an undergrad degree at Penn State in psychology and also focused on social psychology. At that point, I was interested in intergroup relations. So in undergrad with Dr. Terry Vesho at Penn State, we were studying gender stereotyping and our beliefs about women versus men as leaders. And then when I went to do my PhD, I wanted to stay on this theme of intergroup conflict and intergroup relations. And I was studying how people act differently and make different decisions when they're part of a group, making a group decision when it's us versus them, as opposed to a one-on-one interpersonal interaction. And it was there that I started to become really interested in morality and how we have different standards of behavior in different social situations. So our standards when we're in a group can be quite different, right? Because we're helping others. And we called that group morality. And it was then that when I was a first-year grad student at UNC, I started studying guilt and shame and kind of trying to figure out what drives people to act in a more moral way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so if you're anything like me, this path really unfolded over time. And so I can look back and tell a story about how I got to where I am, but it seems like for you, okay, I had an advisor on, now we're looking at decision making in groups, now we're focused on emotions. And was that a big part? Because for you, you're kind of work in organizations and more the business context with honesty, that seems to be pretty unique in terms of a lot of, or at least some of the honesty researchers that I've come across. How did that more organizational business side of it come about for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So it turns out I never took a business course or an economics course my entire life. I guess I still haven't. I studied psychology. Then I did my PhD, and at UNC, the business school is on the other side of campus, so I was never over there. And it wasn't until my first job after my PhD that I learned about business. I was applying to tenure track psychology positions. And there was a job posting that came across the social psychology listserv for a position at Northwestern University's Dispute Resolution Research Center, which is in the Kellogg School of Management within the Department of Management and Organizations. And it was sent by a colleague whose work I knew, Dr. Adam Galinsky, and who had done some research similar to what I was working on in my dissertation on empathy. And so I kind of said, oh, look, there's some interesting people there, and my work's on conflict. I'll apply to this position. So I applied, and I was flown out for a job talk, and it turns out I was a great fit, and they offered me a job on the spot actually that afternoon. Wow. And it was the first time I had really knew about this whole field of organizational behavior. And then in retrospect, it was so fortuitous because I really enjoy being in business school and taking these basic ideas and insights from psychology, but applying them to organizations, to people who work in business. And I enjoy teaching MBA students and executives. So so after I did my postdoc for 2 years, then I kind of discovered this whole field of organizational behavior, which is where I still am today.
Yeah, that's super fun and interesting that was the trajectory there. And so with your recent work, as I was thinking about what the hell are we going to talk about, you've done so much. Recently you and others, Dr. Levine, you've been very central in really expanding our understanding about, I would kind of say, the complexity, right, of honesty. This isn't very simple when we kind of break it down. And so you all have done work to publish this new kind of multi-dimensional framework of honest behavior. And there's a lot to it. Again, the really scientific thing to say is like, this is really complicated. Just kidding. So one of the themes here is it's not just a yes or no, right? An either or. Are we telling the truth or are we lying? But yeah, I'm curious kind of how this came about. Was this a conversation like after the honesty conference? How did the kind of collaboration of let's really start breaking this down and thinking about it from this multidimensional perspective?
Yes. So how it came about for this particular paper. So the particular paper you're talking about is the forthcoming publication we have in the Academy of Management Annals, where we argue that honesty is more than just belief speaking. It's more than just saying what you believe to be true, but it also requires that we seek the truth and foster understanding of the truth in others. So we call it truth seeking, belief speaking, and fostering understanding of the truth in others. And this is different, I think, from prior work, which, as you highlighted, is more binary. You either said something that the content of it is true, it's a true statement versus a false statement. And so here we're taking the view that it's more dyadic, that we can't just take the perspective of the communicator and whether that communicator says something that is technically true or not, but it's a communication behavior, meaning there's a communicator and the recipient, and we have to look at both sides. And there's lots of creative ways that people can deviate from honesty that don't involve making false statements. So how we came to that, I'm not sure if there's one specific event, but if I back up to how Emma Levine and I started working together on this topic, and then that was, I think, 2015 or so is when I met her. She was a second-year PhD student. I was a faculty member. We were at a small business ethics conference at Notre Dame University. And I was sat next to her at the conference and started talking with her about her research on pro-social lies. I don't think it was published yet, but I thought it was brilliant. I thought she was brilliant. And then I just liked her interpersonally and found out she went to undergrad with my brother. And so we had all these connections, and we stayed in touch. And at some point early on, this is more the backstory for our other paper, but it will get to the current one. Emma had published 2 papers that showed that we trust people even when they lie, when we think they have these benevolent intentions, which she called pro-social lies. And it was really interesting, to say we trust people who we know are lying to us, right? And so that was very counterintuitive, but also made sense in that we do look at people's intentions. And so in our conversations about that, and Emma was getting ready to work on her dissertation, and this was part of it, I come from a background really valuing honesty, and of course I value kindness and benevolence and candor as well, but I was a little skeptical of the generality of this conclusion that even when people are not honest, that we appreciate that. And I do think there's some circumstances where that is certainly true, and Emma's subsequent work has outlined those. But I wanted to push her and us together collectively to take these insights into the field and see what we could learn, to see what is it like if people are honest in their daily lives or kind in their daily lives, if we sort of pitted them against each other. And so that is what ultimately led to the 2018 paper, which we can talk about, and I think Emma has talked about on the show. So it turns out we liked working together and publishing, and we had some new ideas. And then once we published that paper where we had people be honest in their daily lives, and what we learned was it wasn't as bad as they thought it would be. It wasn't as bad as we feared it could be for them. And it turns out it was this wonderful experience for many people, even when it was hard. And what was interesting there is that when we learned when people are anticipating what this would be like, they think a lot about how uncomfortable or awkward, how the target's going to react negatively. But then when they actually have the conversations, it goes differently. And part of the reason I think it goes differently is people figure out a way to also be benevolent when they can be honest and communicate in different ways. I mean, and so I'd say that paper and some of the conversations that followed, I started to think more expansively about honesty and the different ways we communicate. And then sort of fast forward to 2020 when the group at Wake Forest University, Christian Miller, who's also been on the show, and the psychologist there, Will Fleeson, Mike Furr, and Aranda Jaya Wickgream, they invited me part of this honesty project, this bit like to what do we know about honesty?
Yeah.
This sort of a big multi-million-dollar project. And so then I called up Emma and said, Emma, we have this opportunity to apply for a grant. Like, let's think big. What do we want to know? And so Emma and I was on maternity leave at the time. So it was an interesting time. I can track all these thoughts with the age of my kids. But I was, managed to get it together because I thought it was this amazing opportunity, and talked with Emma throughout that summer, as well as the Wake Forest team, to think of what we wanted to learn. And so that's where this, a long way of getting to the answer to your question, we started to think about honesty as complex and what we wanted to know, and how do people navigate this tension between wanting to help others and the relationships, but also be honest, and also, sometimes we want things to go well for ourselves or to avoid bad outcomes. And the seed for this current paper was actually me feeling uncertain that I knew a lot of what had been studied in honesty. And so after we got the grant, we were writing this white paper, this review of sort of the state of the field. And at that point, I did not feel confident that I knew everything there was to know about the field, literature on honesty. I sort of knew some narrow slices of it, because my prior work had focused mainly on moral character, which is related but a little different.
Yeah.
And so the impetus for the current paper was to review everything that had ever been written, essentially, at least in management and organizations, the field I'm in, and figure out what do we know. And so I could feel confident that if I'm one of the leaders on this honesty project, that I would know what had been done. And so that I wrote this late night email on my phone one night when I couldn't sleep to Emma and the other collaborators in the paper, and it was the idea. Or part of the motivation that ultimately became this Academy of Management Annals paper, where we had some initial ideas that then unfolded over time.
Yeah. So, and one of the aspects here that you alluded to that I think is just so important, and in my clinical work, right, as a clinical psychologist, it's just almost by definition is this relational aspect, right? Which is, the way you all put it, it's kind of like shared responsibility for what's happening here. So I will communicate to you, but even if I say something truthful, like, why am I saying it? What is the intention? And there's an obligation on my end to foster that understanding in you so I can communicate truthfully. But just like you're saying, we have all these little interesting ways we can go about saying that would be more or less likely that you would walk away with a certain impression. So even with this nice smile that I have talking about, we're really going to have to downsize like the company, you know what I mean? And eye contact and how we're presenting ourselves, just that relational aspect of, so it's not only going to be a conversation, but then how is the other person reacting? What do you want them to take away? And I'm just curious, as you were going through that literature, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot done with that, like communication delivery, how we go about doing this stuff in a relational situation, right, with people.
There's one paper that is very impactful or influential, especially on me and my colleagues. It's by Todd Rogers and colleagues on Paltering. And this is the idea that people sometimes use truthful statements to mislead others. And they were studying the negotiation context. And that paper, and there's a few others. Maury Schweitzer has been involved in many of these publications, and his colleagues, where they've studied dodging and deflecting direct questions. Brad Bitterly is another colleague on these. And there's this pattern across these papers where even if the communicator is not lying, not making false statements, if they're saying something that's technically true, a palter, or maybe they're dodging, the communicator might think, okay, I'm ethical more or less, I didn't lie. But the recipient of that information is like, you still misled me. Even if what you said was true, but especially if people think they did it deliberately, but you still misled me. And there's this asymmetry between how we view ourselves when we are the communicator and we focus on this content of the communication. But then on the recipients of the information, it's less about the content and more about, did you foster understanding of the truth through how you communicated, the level of disclosure, and also what you said. And I think this asymmetry is interesting. And there's a few of these papers, a little bit, that suggest this pattern, but I would agree with you that there's not a lot on this topic from the recipient's perspective on this asymmetry, and also more generally on how do people communicate truthfully or not. That said, there is quite a bit on communication delivery, especially on directness versus indirectness. So the cross-cultural psychology literature and especially the organizational literature on cultural differences, multicultural teams. There's some work on within conflict management about directness versus indirectness, which is communication delivery. But that hasn't really focused on honesty per se,
right? Because
honesty traditionally has been viewed as the content. Is it true versus false? Whereas this other work on, say, directness or indirectness has been on the communication delivery and the style. And so part of what we're doing in this current work is bringing these different ideas together to think about how a person can communicate so that the other side develops an understanding of the truth, true beliefs, which can be done directly or indirectly. There's ways in which people can communicate more indirectly such that the other person can understand. But there's also cases where if someone is too indirect, especially if there's differences, they don't know each other well, or different cultural backgrounds, indirect communication, the recipient might feel like, I don't understand what you're saying, or even that you actively misled me by obfuscating the truth.
Yeah. And this brings up, when you were talking, the work you've done on feedback, right? Because that, by definition, you're now letting somebody know your opinion either on their performance or what they did. And there's a whole complexity there about one thing that really stood out that seems relevant in terms of this multidimensional framework too, is just, are you communicating about somebody's behavior, like somebody's action, what they did? You didn't take out the trash. This isn't an organizational thing, but it's not that you're a terrible romantic partner because you didn't do it. It's actually not about the person. We are giving feedback on behavior that has less of a sting, right? And clinically, this comes up a lot too, is separating ourselves from our behavior, our thoughts, and our emotions. And part of this fostering understanding seems like very skillful ways of lowering those barriers and not getting people super defensive. How we go about doing that and exactly what we are communicating honestly about, not the person, but the specific behavior, right?
Yeah. The specific behavior is so critical. And when you and I met this summer at the conference, you said, feedback should be truthful and useful. So I'm going to borrow your term there, because I think it's a great way to, and memorable way to capture this idea. And it becomes relevant to giving feedback about the person's whole self versus behavior, because when it's about a person, the whole, you are like this, that's not useful, right? Because it's very hard to change yourself, but but you can change your behavior, and you can, take different actions, and ultimately you change, enough of your behaviors over time. You change, maybe your personality, your habits more generally. That idea, it's very ingrained in the feedback literature. It relates to my earlier research on guilt and shame. And the core difference between this feeling of guilt and feeling of shame, at least through some conceptualizations, is guilt is more focused on the behavior. I feel bad about what I've done.
Yeah.
And shame is I'm ashamed of myself. And it's this more global negative evaluation. And because it's more difficult to change yourself, and if you feel like your whole self is flawed, what can you do with that? It often leads people to want to hide, withdraw. It leads to more defensiveness, anger, externalization. It's not as healthy of an emotion. Whereas with guilt, even though it may be uncomfortable, even painful, if we feel like we've really harmed someone, if we can limit it to a more specific action, I did this thing, it caused harm, I can now apologize, do something different, change how I am in the future. There's a path forward. And people still may be defensive to really admit that they have done something that has harmed another person. But if it's more localized to the behavior, then it's, can be more useful, right? So that idea has always resonated with me because what we really want to do is foster more guilt rather than shame when a person has done something wrong, right? Not feeling guilty all the time, but if you've done something wrong. And that relates very well to feedback. And when we're trying to give feedback that people will be receptive to, right, as opposed to defensive. When we give feedback that they can understand, or they can discern the truth, right, we need to tailor it around their behavior more specifically and concretely, because that's what's ultimately going to be truthful and useful, to use your term.
Well, thank you. And the thing about useful for me is it just has a pragmatism of, it brings in, well, why are we actually doing this, right? Yeah. We are giving feedback, and with you and Emma's work, like the benevolently honest thing to do is, well, hopefully we have an idea of, in this case with feedback, let's say it's in a business or whatever context, we're not only giving that feedback, but we're also outlining a path forward of, and what can be done. Right. Just like you're saying, if you're just a terrible employee, right, that's what you walk away. Well, I can't fix that because that's who I am. You've identified with that belief, right? But if it's just about, hey, when you did this and whatever report, here's the specific thing. And next time, if we do that, it's very specific. And you're pretty much identifying how this can be a win-win. It's not this kind of imbalance. It's, we're now working as a team with this kind of shared decision-making approach. And as I'm talking, I guess that really goes to that fostering understanding. And it's this shared responsibility of, is it going to be helpful? Is it going to be something that's ultimately productive versus just, we're going to be honest because that's who we are, more of that brutal honesty, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think in the newer work we're doing on feedback, when we're trying to distill what is it that allows feedback to be, benevolently honest, and we've honed in on the role of support of as opposed to praise, and this idea that you've done your past performance, maybe there was a problem in it, but here's what we can do moving forward. And I believe you can do this, and I have high expectations. I know you can meet them, and here are resources. And the support and conveying that you believe in the person, that they can do better. I think that is the critical element of the benevolence piece of it. The belief that you want them to do well, you think they can do well. And that's different than, some other ways that we might just be nice or say something that involves praise, oh, good job, or, that was great colors in your slide deck, or something that's sort of irrelevant.
Right. You really finished your presentation on time.
Yeah, right, exactly. And these and sometimes we say those things to be nice, but on the recipient, people usually know when something has gone well or not. And that sort of praise that's sort of tangential or irrelevant, it doesn't really foster trust, and it doesn't allow the person who's hearing it to to understand how they could improve on the things that really matter. And so thinking about how you can provide this feedback and convey support so that the person can improve, and that you care about them enough that you're going to have the hard conversation and tell them the things that they may not want to hear, but that will ultimately be beneficial.
And that piece right there, like, that is one of the central nuggets underlying, if you talk about PTSD in the clinical field, you talk about a phobia, right? Social, giving a presentation, or a phobia of animals. You talk about anxiety disorders, relationship difficulties, the willingness to experience discomfort in the moment, right? This may bring up fear. I feel anxiety. And so much of the time we just avoid, right? We push it away. We try to escape from that. And that, by the way, because it works, right? It brings the anxiety down. However, the bummer is it never allows this new learning, let's say in PTSD, right? If I go to this, location where I was abused, that's going to happen again. If we continue to avoid that, well, we don't need to experience it. But if it might be safe, that then allows new learning to occur. So those intrusive memories and emotions and all the stuff that goes along with it, right? New learning can happen. So this avoidance of momentary discomfort versus the benefits over the long term of doing that difficult thing. I think in the forum when you were talking about your research, that was one of the key takeaways is avoidance of that short-term discomfort versus the long-term gains. In this case, let's say of an honest conversation. That's just that's such a huge part of this. And it makes sense because it's super hard sometimes to be willing to have these conversations. But just like you said in your research, not as bad as we might think, right? Sometimes.
Not as bad as we might think. And also, even when it's bad, even when it's
Right.
hard conversation, usually it leads to more positive benefits in the long term. Not always. I think negative things can happen. But the thing we often neglect to think about is the benefit our honesty can provide.
Yeah.
And this became very clear to us in this 2018 paper that Emma and I wrote, where we had people be honest in their lives and had people come into the lab in Chicago and have these difficult conversations, give feedback to a friend or a partner, or just have these more intimate conversations. And what we learned there is people so often just focus on the short term, how the person's not going to want to hear, whatever it is they need, that they are going to share. But we underestimate the value of this truthful information because we focus so much on the short-term difficulty rather than the long-term benefits. I recently gave a presentation on this work, and I pulled out some quotes from that 2018 paper where we had people to be honest in their daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what was so clear in reading what happened. And so just the background in the study is we had people be honest in all their conversations for 3 days, and we would survey them every night and then 2 weeks later. And some of the information we collected, especially in the 2 weeks later, and also in those daily surveys, when we asked people, what did you talk about? Did you have honest conversations? And we collected these observations where people said, I had been put off having these conversations. And now that I have it, it's such a relief. So I can read you one quote if you're
please.
interested.
Yeah.
So this was a person who had a conversation with a roommate, and she said, I felt less fake when I didn't have to lie about what I thought about some things or say I felt fine when I didn't. Tension was building up with my roommate because I couldn't bring myself to tell her the things she was doing that were annoying. And while doing the study, I told her all those things I had been avoiding to tell her for a while, and it felt kind of liberating. Some of the things were kind of awkward, but others felt good, and it helped ease some of the tension. I learned that it feels better to say those kinds of things instead of keeping them inside until it explodes. And so that comment was similar to others where another woman shared she broke up with her boyfriend over the course of the study.
Yep.
Which on the surface, you might think, well, that's awful. But the way she described it was more similar. Like, this was a conversation that needed to happen. And yes, it was hard. But ultimately, this was so much better for me, for both of us. And we were able to have the conversation in a productive way, even though it is a difficult thing to talk about. And that awareness, that sort of that change in focus from going into it, I'm thinking all about how hard it's going to be. But then after doing it, people are like, oh, this was so helpful and ultimately better, because otherwise it would have just led to an explosion where it could have been much worse, or people keep it inside and then act in passive aggressive ways, or, things along those lines. So that has stuck with me in terms of how often our focus is much more on the discomfort, the emotions, usually the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think so much about how what we're sharing can really be beneficial, especially to the other side. It's helpful for us often, but there's two biases that come into play. One, we tend to think, about ourselves more than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're all the center of our own world. But also we all tend to think very short term rather than long term, right?
Yes.
And so I think these two things together kind of contribute to this idea that we're not so good at thinking about the long-term benefits, especially for other people.
Yes, absolutely. And there was so much in that quote. That was one of my favorite parts, by the way, of that paper, is that you all included the quotes, because it just humanizes this process, right? And that one you just read, it hits on these two themes that I think about so much. And one is when she said, I just no longer, I believe, like, just feel fake, right? So this concept of genuineness and feeling authentic, that there's no longer that cognitive burden of, we're trying to interact, but that thought of, oh, that really bothers me, or I need to get out of this relationship, like whatever it is, even though it's hard in the short term, that burden that we've been carrying around sometimes for years or decades, we can finally put that down, right? That persona that we adopt, that mask that we put on, we can start to slide that a little bit over, and people can actually see who we are. That armor that we put on to protect ourselves, we can start taking that off. So in my personal experience too, it really leads to this. It's just a feeling of openness. Like, oh, I actually can just say what is, I actually believe to be the case, that's truthful. It's this weight that seems lifted. And number two, that notion of, I've been avoiding this until it'll just explode. So the metaphor often of just like, if you have a soda and you keep shaking it up, right? What's going to eventually happen when you take off the lid? Yeah, like, it's just going to explode everywhere. But then what happens if just, in the moment, it's a little shake and you just take off the lid a little bit, like that's, or you're boiling a pot and there's a little bit of a release on the steam. This can be the new way we can live our lives, of just gradually letting people into what we believe to be true, and just owning we can totally be wrong. But this is what's coming up for me. It's in a relationship, and we avoid that bottling explosion where, that can go catastrophically and, end relationships in some situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know I made a note when I was reading the work on the feedback about I think the note was something like, why the feedback sandwich sucks, with the smiley face. Because this is something we hear so much about. Well, I have to deliver some difficult news, right? Let's go ahead and, I won't describe it. Maybe can you talk about the feedback sandwich and why that might not be the optimal way we want to think about giving some hard feedback?
So the feedback sandwich, it's interesting. I started studying feedback, and specifically benevolent honesty where you're also promoting the well-being of the other side. And then I realized when I would present on this, the very first question I would get when I would talk about feedback is, what do you think of the feedback sandwich? I was on an NPR show focused on feedback a year or two ago in conference presentations. And so I said, I need to really think about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so the feedback sandwich, it is an attempt to have some truthful information, convey some truthful information, but also some kindness. Where it falls short is it doesn't really achieve either of those goals, because person's saying something nice, often some kind of praise, and it's usually not as so substantive or critical to the issue. So they say something nice. Then there's this hard, difficult truth, right? The brutal honesty. And then at the end, there's some nice thing said. And the difference between the feedback sandwich and what I would call benevolent honesty is, with benevolent honesty, we're integrating the honesty and benevolence. So I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations. I know you can reach them. That's very different than saying, I think you're wonderful. That presentation was awful, but you have a great outfit today, or something that the person is like, I don't even understand what you're saying. Right? So this barrier to receiving effective feedback, one, the person has to understand what's important, right? What are you really trying to communicate? I think the feedback sandwich often leads to a lot of confusion. You said this was good, but then you said this other thing, and how consequential is the more negative piece of information versus these other positive statements? I think there's a lot of confusion where a person can't discern the truth in the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it can hinder trust, because people, if you're the feedback recipient and you're waiting, and this person's saying all these nice things and you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, then it can affect the trust and your receptivity. Are you going to be open to this information? And so when I think of these two barriers to receiving feedback of receptivity and discerning the truth, the feedback sandwich is falling short on both. And what's missing is the support, the really conveying concern for the recipient and wanting to help them. And the nice sort of positive statements that people communicate because they think that's going to make the person more receptive. Often they're not really effective at achieving that goal, right? Because the person's just waiting for the negative information. And when it's sandwiched and the positive information is disconnected from the more critical or negative feedback, then it's not clear how to integrate them. And it's not useful if you don't know what to do with it, if you don't know how to change. And so it's certainly important to give positive feedback as well, but that should also be substantive, about the behavior, and it shouldn't be used just to warm the person up so you can then attack them later.
Yeah.
And so that's what some of my concerns with the feedback sandwich. But what's interesting is on the surface, you might think, oh, it's benevolent, it's honest, or you have these things. And I think that's the attraction of that method. But at least in, I think, how it's often delivered, it's not really achieving the goals of making the person more receptive and providing the information that they can actually use to learn and grow.
Yeah. And one thing, I know for me, when I heard about the feedback sandwich, part of the appeal, I think, to this is it actually gives some kind of a framework. It gives some kind of a method of, oh, I know I have to deliver this. I can go positive, the hard feedback, and then positive. And when I'm thinking about, your work and Emma's work and all the teams about how do we actually go about promoting this stuff in our daily life, having some kind of a method for these skills, right? In communication, these tools and practices for communication delivery. I know in my field, there's populations that struggle with regulating emotions, and that can lead to really difficult interpersonal relationships. And so there's like a breakdown of skills of here's how you might actually go about having a conversation. Okay. So it's, what are your goals? Like, why are you even doing this? Based on, not just what are your objectives, how do you want the other person to feel about you after the conversation's over? These are interpersonal effectiveness skills. Like, regardless of the outcome, just based on how you approach this, how would you like them to think about you after it's over? And then also thinking about how do you want to feel about yourself after this is over, regardless of whether they do the thing or they, validate your statement of saying no to a request. So this gets to like self-respect, right? And not compromising, being assertive. And then it goes through this whole step-by-step thing of, can you describe the situation factually? Can you express your opinions and ideas? Can you actually assert your request? Can you take the other person's perspective? How might this benefit them in addition to you, right? So many complexities about, do you tend to over-apologize? Is it the right time? Do you want to maintain eye contact? What about negotiation? Is it all or nothing? And so, but that for a lot of people and myself, like, whoa, I really would have benefited from this information when I was in middle school or high school. And so as you're thinking about communication delivery, and if it's not that feedback sandwich, I don't know, how are you thinking about, is there a way to break down benevolent honesty or, a kind of method to replace something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very timely because I teach a course on managing people and teams here at the Tepper School. And tomorrow's lesson is on giving and receiving feedback.
Nice.
And so the framework we use here, which is not my own, it comes, I think, originally from the Center for Creative Leadership, and to my leadership coaching colleagues have shared it with me. We call it SBI, for situation, behavior, impact. And so what you highlight about the feedback sandwich is it gives you a formula or steps.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, when I teach about feedback, not necessarily benevolent feedback specifically, but just what is a general model for how you can do this well, we use this SBI framework. So first, the situation, you're setting the context, you're helping the person focus on what you're referring to. So the other day when we had agreed that everyone would send their project ideas to the group, right? That's the situation. And then you can talk about the specific behavior. I noticed that you never send in your project ideas, right? So that's a specific behavior focused on the action, right? Not the general. And then the impact, because it didn't get done, our team couldn't meet to discuss the ideas as planned. Now we're behind schedule, right? That's the impact it had on the team. And then you can follow it with either proposing some alternative or to ask a question. So it could be an SBII with an inquire, right? Situation, behavior, impact, and then inquire where you're getting the person involved. So, what's your perspective on this? What can we do next time to make sure this doesn't happen again? You could also make it an SBIA for situation, behavior, impact, alternative, right? So when things happen, and they do, we need you to let us know that you'll miss the deadline so we can make a plan to move forward. And so, that's a common example teams face. But by giving people this formula, talk about the situation more generally, set the context, and there's where the benevolence can come in, where, if you're giving interpersonal feedback, letting them know that the goal of it is to, help them improve. And then it's about the specific behavior and then the impact. This is why it's a problem. Here's the effects that this had. And then in kind of asking questions or proposing alternatives in a way that the other will be receptive to and figure out how you can make a plan. So then it's actionable. And so that's the model we use here. And there's other similar ones. I think a few years ago, we used to call it the STAR method, which is another one. People use that on job interview questions as well. Situation, task, action, result. Same idea, different acronym. But I think all of these are different ways in which you're communicating in a way that the person understands what's the context, that it's not just you're always like this happened.
Yes.
It's kind of very focused on here's the particular situation with an example. You're talking about a specific behavior. You're trying to give them feedback that's actionable. It's goal-oriented, for the group to perform better on our next project. This is, it's in service of this goal. And then, thinking of what we talk about with benevolence, making sure that the comments are supportive, letting them know that you care about them and you think they can, improve moving forward.
Yeah. And so I appreciate those acronyms. Like there's STAR, there's, SBI, SBII, SBIA. Yeah. And in this particular thing for me, it's like the Dear Man script, like describe, express, assert, reinforce, stay mindful, appear confident, negotiate. Like these things, they're really complex ideas. But when you can put them in this kind of a formatic, and in my experience and my own personal experience, it just helps to say, well, what am I missing? And then to learn from it, like, oh, that really didn't go like I thought it was going to go. Oh, that's right. I used the word like always. You never do this. And so avoiding those extremes, right? Focusing on the example, not the person. Again, it's very complex, but once you start to view it, I think, as complex, appropriately so, it opens up this whole kind of world of skillfulness about, well, honest reflection on how we tend to communicate. And if there's a willingness and a desire, how do we use some of these tools from the literature and the empirical research to then put it into our daily lives, if not organizations and companies moving forward, right?
Yeah, I think these simple tools can be very powerful. One of the other courses I teach and have taught for a long time is negotiations. And part of when I do negotiation training is I talk about a negotiation planning document, how you can prepare effectively to organize all the information. And briefly, the key thing that I think is helpful is you make a column for yourself with what are your interests, what are your priorities, if you rank ordered the different issues, and then you do the same for the other side. And one story I share when I teach is about how powerful these simple tools can be. Because when you just talk about, it's a framework, it doesn't seem groundbreaking, this makes sense. But too often, as you highlight, when we're in the moment, and if we don't have the script or the mental model, or it's not rehearsed, we can miss this. And it was an experience of a friend of mine, my friend Andrea, who was going through a difficult experience with an organizational restructure at her job some years ago. And I gave her some negotiation advice and sent her this planning document. And what was so powerful was that a few days later, and she called me and she was like, Taya, that planning document changed everything. And I was like, really? Wow. I was really surprised. I was like, really, that simple sort of tool? And she's like, yeah, before I had this framework for planning, it felt like my whole life was being negotiated and there was all these different issues. And then once I sort of sat down with these 2 columns, I realized actually I cared about 3 things. And my boss and who's supervisor, they cared about a different 3 things. And, the issues that were important to me, my job title, it was a change that would have made her go from a director level to an associate director through this restructure. Something she really cared about. There's these few things. She's like, they actually probably didn't care very much. They cared that I was reporting to someone in Africa rather than the US with this new restructure. That was fine with me. And so I share this example every time I teach, and it has stuck with me because it was this simple tool, which on the surface I'd been teaching for so long and kind of became very intuitive and obvious. But when she had this experience using this tool and this framework, it changed what could have been a really dire situation. She was thinking about leaving her job, and she was a high performer. It would have been bad all around. But then she could see it when she had the framework. That actually it's not my whole life being negotiated, right? And all the stress with that. It's I care about these things, and they probably care about something else. And now I know my strategy because now I know what conversation I need to have.
Yes.
Anyway, it was wonderful. She ended up keeping her title. She got a raise. She reported to the person that they wanted her to. It was this fantastic example of creating value in negotiation through a simple tool and framework.
But these tools and frameworks, I mean, just like what you said, there's something so different about having all the information in here, right? It's in our mind. We're trying to work it out. But if there's whatever framework, if it's 2 columns or if it's a step-by-step thing, often it's really fun in my experience clinically to start with, well, what are your goals? Like, what do you actually want? And just the blank stares about, I've never even thought of that. And so we're going into a conversation trying to say something, but we don't have clarity. Like in your case with your friend, maybe it's just 3 things. And so taking time for self-reflection, and if you have the luxury before, like you mentioned, that conversation where our emotions are going to go up. And if, you're anything like me, what I just planned on saying, that goes completely out the door, right? But if we've thought it through and we might have even rehearsed it, like these are the main points for me, oftentimes too, the values, like why this is important to me. Why do I care about it? We almost can't help but be more confident and sit up a little bit straighter because there's clarity there. We know what we want, why we want it. We're able to negotiate. It seems simple, but in my experience, the more simple, typically the more powerful. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's difficult work, but it's not that complicated oftentimes. Yeah. There's one aspect too about, well, how do you move this from, we've talked a lot about individual conversations, right? This is feedback that you're going to give. Maybe it's in an organization, but you're also doing now work about, there was this meaningful work in building an ethical future forum, right? That you were a part of. I believe, you were part of the organizational.
Yes, I organized this event. It was a conference we held in February at the Tepper School that I organized with Erica Chung, who you may have heard of. She's the founder of the nonprofit Ethics and Entrepreneurship, but became well known because she was the key whistleblower, one of the key whistleblowers in the Theranos scandal. She had filed a report with regulators. And I got connected with her through one of the, an alumnus from the Tepper School, John Levinson. And Erica and I, along with another business ethics colleague here, Derek Lieben, decided we would put on a conference and career fair focused on ethics. And then we expanded it actually to include meaningful work and take, these ideas and conversations that people are having in different fields and thinking about what, if all social change begins with a conversation. That was sort of one of the running themes of, people say, we want the world to be better, more ethical, more meaningful work. This seems to be something that people care about, or at least they say they care about. And so what does that look like? And what are the different challenges and issues in different industries? And when it comes to AI and big data and these, what are the challenges there? Healthcare, cryptocurrency, all these different challenges. And so we brought together largely through Erica and different connections and different people that she's met and spoken with at conferences. We brought together this really interesting and impressive group of speakers from all different areas who each could speak about ethics and meaningful work from diverse perspectives, but to bring together into the same room and into these conversations, a lot of different thoughts about how we can build a more ethical future. And so it was a wonderful thing to be a part of. I'm not sure yet where we'll go next. Maybe we'll do another conference in the future, but all the videos are online through the conference website. So I'm glad we were able to capture that, and so we can go back and look at them.
Yeah,
and learn from them.
I'll definitely include that in the notes too for the show. You were kind enough to send that to me. And yeah, just watching those, some of those videos. And one of the many things that stood out to me is just really appreciating the interdisciplinary nature of this, right? Like a lot of the people I've spoken to, like on, for the podcast and for the app, like these are researchers like yourself and Emma doing this work, but there's also psychologists who are applying this clinically. There's also, just across the board in business. And then you're talking about crypto, and there was the legal aspects. And one thing that was eye-opening is like, oh yeah, if you're going to be a whistleblower, what are those legal protections that are open to you? Which then brings up disclosure. Like, is this the time? What's the kind of pros and cons that are going to happen? So yeah, just your kind of initiative with, those collaborators of bringing everybody together. Yeah, for me, I'm just curious, what was the reception like to that and thinking through, let's bring in the empirical stuff and the business stuff and the legal stuff? What was the feedback you were getting there from folks?
Yeah, so I'm glad you picked up on some of this. That was one of the motivations. Is too often or most of the time you have either one group talking to another group, right? So it's professors talking to students, or sometimes students talking to professor, or professors talking to business leaders, or the reverse, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't have conversations where you have students, you have professors, researchers, you have business leaders, all different levels. And so that's what we wanted to do, to people to have a conversation and interact. And so in addition to the panels and discussion of the different speakers, we also had a lunch and tables with some questions where people could talk about these ideas. We had a dinner with the speakers, and that was, I think, one of the key elements that we wanted to bring to this event, is to have a conversation that is not just some business leader talking about their company values or their personal values, which a lot of those sorts of conversations, or some professor telling you about the latest research on AI ethics or something. But how do we have a conversation together? And so I think we were successful in sort of starting this. I think I'm glad we have the videos, because I think one of the challenges we realized was there's a lot going on campus in February, and students recruiting and classes. And so in terms of we had it was a relatively small conference, but people came, and I think and those who did really enjoyed it. And then thinking through, how do we have these conversations so it's not just reaching a small segment of the people who happen to be available and here in Pittsburgh. What more can we be doing to foster these conversations? And that's sort of what we're thinking about. But I wanted to bring this point back to one of the first questions you asked me today about how, my trajectory, how I got into studying organizations. And it's interesting reflecting on this event. The reason why I realized so soon after during the day when I had this interview at Kellogg in the business school, why I realized it was such a good fit, and actually maybe even better than psychology, is because I do enjoy interdisciplinary ideas and talking to people who are very different backgrounds. And I didn't realize at the time, when because I'd come right through psychology, I didn't realize at the time really how narrow psychology was, or at least it was at the time. I felt social psychology, where you go to the conference and all the social psychologists are talking to each other and reading each other's work, and there wasn't a lot of engagement outside the field. Yep. I don't know if that's changed since 2008 when I got my PhD, but being in the business school when, and this is a management and organizations department, and here it's called organizational behavior, sort of the same thing, where you have psychologists, you have sociologists, you have people who are more kind of on talking to economists or people in different fields. And in our business school here, we actually don't have departments, so we have colleagues, our offices are intermixed. We're talking to people who are in other areas of the school, marketing, accounting, information systems. And I find I really like that. Same thing with teaching MBA students. They'll go out in all different industries, and I find that interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary interactions really interesting, and especially when it comes to topics like ethics, honesty, conflict, negotiation. Right, we're all doing this all the time in different ways,
Yes.
trying to solve problems effectively, and that was, I think, how I realized it was a good fit for me to be in organizational behavior, because I could take some of these ideas, this fascinating, really deep work that the psychologists were doing, that I was doing, but start to have conversations with other people outside the field about it, and that strengthened the work. And so now, many years later, this conference, that's still, I think, sort of what I'm trying to do, and then also expanding to work with non-academics as well, of people sort of, who are like with Erica Chung's nonprofit, and she's working with early stage companies who, how do you embed ethics early on in the life stage of a company? And these ideas of honesty and ethics, too often it's sort of an afterthought later on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating learning from her and the work she's doing about how do you inculcate these values into early stage companies. And I think it's an interesting area, innovation, entrepreneurship, because there is so much pressure to make things look good. You're communicating with investors. You're trying to talk about your amazing new technology. And, lots of situations, honesty can be challenging. But I do think in the innovation, entrepreneurship space, there's a lot of pressure, and even some culture that has not prioritized honesty, and now maybe we're seeing a little more of a correction after some of these major scandals like Theranos. But it's an interesting space that I hadn't really thought much about until working with Erica Chung on this event.
Yeah, and the fact that this really is just universal, right? These are issues that, whether we are aware of it or not, we are all being more or less truthful. We're all being more or less ethical. Hopefully, we've thought through like what we care about and why, our values. But then, do we keep a couple of different sets of books? Like, this is how we are with our friends. This is how we are at business. This is how we are starting a company. And so, the fact that it is universal, it just speaks to such benefit of bringing in all these different disciplines and all these different fields, because in my experience too, it's been really interesting when you talk to people. Let's say if it's clinical psychology, you bring in neuroscience, you bring in philosophy, you bring in, some neuroimaging folks, you bring in social psychology. It's like, oh, we're all talking about the same things, but we're using super different language, right? So the jargon gets confusing. It's hard to even go to their journals and read their papers. But like you're saying, you get around a dinner table and you start talking to people, and it's not just a lecture, it's now a conversation. That's where it seems like the most impactful, meaningful change can happen. And it's just so fun to see. I loved watching those videos, and I'd encourage listeners to go check that out for sure. Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about yet, and whatever your comfort level is, but for me, I'm always interested in how your work and how everything you're doing is impacting just your own life, right? So, and I know for me, being a parent, we have 4 young kiddos, doing clinical work, just being in my own life with friends and family. It's interesting to have this lens, and for me, the self-awareness of like, wow, I'm doing a lot of stuff that I just wouldn't have realized before thinking about the nuances here. So yeah, I don't know how comfy you are talking about all of this, but I'm always curious in terms of your daily life, how this work has impacted you.
Yeah, I mean, it's always in the background. I think I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and these are core values. And how do I make sure I'm communicating the value of honesty and giving feedback, or which it's constant, whether we think about it feedback or not. We're always trying to teach our children, and so this idea of focusing on the behavior versus who they are as a person, that's very central from my work, previous work on guilt versus shame. Of wanting to let them know that they can do something different in the future, and they're still a wonderful person. And I mentioned my mom was a child psychologist. And so I have lots of conversations with her, and she just tell your children how wonderful they are. Eventually they will become wonderful. and so when they do things that are not, giving feedbacks, honest so they can learn, but very targeted behavior. So I think that's something that was, I think, intuitive for me because it was modeled so much by my own family, but it is very salient now from the, academic perspective when I'm studying feedback and the importance of support. I've realized the feedback in particular is hard. I find myself now at this point in my career where I'm working with many doctoral students and postdocs and lots of demands on my time. And now we communicate all the time on email and phone. And I like to have a zero inbox, so I often respond very quickly on my phone to things. And sometimes things maybe I should wait a little and write a longer email when I write out these one line. And I don't know if I've changed anything, but I certainly am a little more mindful on the support side. If I'm giving a disagreement or more negative kinds of feedback, I'm trying to be a bit more mindful on how I convey the support, even if it's not writing a lot, but just conveying that this is a specific thing that needs to change, but maybe we're working on a paper with a co-author or something. And especially if it's a student. And so thinking about how do I convey that support? So again, as we were talking about the frameworks and the lenses, I've become more mindful of the way in which I communicate and how it fits in or doesn't into these frameworks. As I mentioned, I've always valued honesty, and my family, my mom likes to tell stories about if I didn't want to do something, I would just say no, and we'd have an argument, take it head on. Bit different than when my brother was young, and he was did not embrace conflict nearly as much as I did. So, she would have different stories. And so clearly there is a theme there. But I think I've tried to, be more mindful about the support. But again, I for a different podcast I did on the hidden brain last month, they were asking for all these personal stories. And so I reached out to some college roommates and friends about my honesty, because they really wanted these stories about basically times I'd pissed people off with being too honest. It was actually really wonderful, because the emails I got back from a few friends who I hadn't spoken with a while and roommates was they did describe me as diplomatic and really conveying that concern and support. So that was reassuring to hear. So I think a lot of this is now what's different in studying these things is I have more of a framework to understand.
Yeah.
And I'd say also through my teaching, when I've taught about culture and directness, I mentioned, I've become a little more mindful of how people can communicate honestly differently, and that it can be more indirect, because I have a very direct style. And of course, my own style is what all of us think our own styles is the one that's best, or at least for ourselves. Yeah. And I think I've got a growing appreciation for different styles of communication, or at least trying to, and some of the ways and complexity with which we communicate. So I don't know that so I certainly haven't become more indirect, but I maybe a growing appreciation of the different ways people can be honest or not, and thinking through how do we communicate that care, and along with fostering understanding of the truth.
Yeah. And I mean, I think kind of, similar to what you're saying is just an awareness of like my own style. Right? Like, am I direct? Am I indirect? And for me, interestingly, I mean, even though these are skills and tools that, I'm trained in, that I teach, like I do not like conflict, right? I don't think a lot of people like it, but I get super uncomfortable with that. And I know when we were at the honesty conference, I think Emma, like, she's on my team, right? It's like, it really makes us uncomfortable. And so, but then having not just the framework, but some of these tools of like, okay, knowing that this, and I really view this as a practice, like these, because they're more values, right? Honesty is a value. It's not a goal. I can't check that off a box and say, okay, well, I'm done with that. What next? It's in this moment, in this conversation with you, am I communicating clearly? Is this truthful? It can be more or less. But as long as it's the process and we're committing to at least aligning our behavior with these chosen values, to me, I really view this as just an ongoing journey. And the more I learn, the more I can kind of fine tune that. And I can just so much more clearly see my own personal shortcomings of where I want to be. Yeah. But that's great for me, which is like, that's actually progress.
Yeah.
And talk about a reality check on myself as a person having kids. You have a 4 and a 6-year-old. We have an 8, 6, 4, and 2. It's just, it's a whole new kind of lens on not just honesty and things like empathy and compassion and all that, but also age appropriateness of, you want to be truthful, but you bring in the useful. How do we communicate it? Like my father just died a few months ago. And so what do we say about where Papa is? How do they handle mortality? And huge questions that come up. But now there's the complexity of, well, what about disclosure? What about, are they cognitively able to, do you make up a lie? Do you not? I mean, we don't do that. But so anyway, that's opening a whole can. But to me, it's just been really, really interesting to reflect on my own life. And
Yeah, it is interesting. And I'd say you mentioned you and Emma, the default or something is the more kindness. I think where I have room for growth, I think about my husband and I, neither of us shy away from conflict, even when we should, right? When there should be, okay, let's back down. This conversation is going nowhere. That is something I think certainly I could learn from you and Emma in terms of, I think they're, like you said, when we have emotions, when we're in the moment, we kind of go to our defaults and it can be in the extreme. And I would say, even though in most of my interactions, I'm good at this balance, I think, of also being caring and concerned, but certainly within a marriage, it's, from time to time, especially raising kids can be more difficult. And so then it's like, I don't, there is a value in communicating truthfully and what you believe to be right and kind of making sure the other person understands. But then there's also a value at some point saying, okay, we're done with it. This conversation, we need to take a break. Now is not the time. Neither of us are going to be receptive in this moment. And that's hard, right? And so it's much easier to teach and other things than to live it out. But the other thing I would say about having difficult conversations that are age appropriate, and you mentioned talking about death and what happens, and that is something that I think a lot about in honesty. And my husband also values honesty a lot. And thinking about how we have these conversations, like my husband's grandmother died last year, and what happens? Where's Nana? What happens to her body? And how do we have those conversations in a way that we feel are true to our beliefs and values, that are honest yet age appropriate? And it's challenging. And I think so much of the dishonesty with children, with parents, is not because people want to lie to their kids, and it's that these are hard to figure out. How do you communicate truthfully, but in a way that will ultimately help them? And going back to the question you asked about the motivation for this current paper, this honesty framework. One of the big reasons we wanted to do the systematic review and put forward this multidimensional framework is because so much of the prior literature in management and psychology and behavioral economics, all these fields, it's all about decisions to lie for personal gain, like to make money in an economic game, which isn't a nice, clean way you can study lying. But a lot of times our motivation for not being fully honest, either through disclosure or even making false statements, is not for this personal gain. And these conversations with children really highlight that. And if people aren't prepared, or if they think they're protecting them, I think, again, it's often short-term focused, because it's going to help in this moment. The child's not going to ask any more questions. Okay, you've settled that. But there can be real long-term consequences that, often we don't realize until much further down the road. And when I think of why people aren't honest, why we don't give feedback effectively, there's the motivation side as well as the skill side. And we talked about the importance of these frameworks, for example, with feedback earlier. And a lot of that I see is the skill, right? You're giving, if people have the skills, then they'd be more willing to do it. But then there's also the motivation as well. And, and that's where this idea that we might think these conversations are going to be worse than they are, or we think our children can't handle honesty, when maybe there is a way we can communicate in a way that they could understand that will ultimately help them. And so one of the open questions right now, that I'm is like how much of the reason people aren't honest is because they don't really have the skills to have these difficult conversations effectively. Like maybe parents don't know how to have these conversations well with their children, versus more on the motivation that they don't believe it will be helpful, or the beliefs, because both of these things play a role. And if we want to encourage more honesty in people, I think we need to come at it from both angles, right? Changing people's motivation so they see the benefits of honesty, as well as giving people the skill to have these conversations in ways that are age appropriate, and not just age appropriate, but if it's in the workplace, for example, how do you have conversations that are professionally appropriate or appropriate for that relationship? What needs, and especially in certain roles, jobs that you may legally and ethically be required to withhold information. Like if you're a lawyer, if you're a clinical psychologist, right? You can't just share everything you believe to be true. But how do you communicate honestly in a situation where the person might ask you questions that you're not allowed to share? And I think that's also a place where people get into trouble, because their first reaction, it's either have to have complete and full disclosure or lie. And I don't think that's the binary that we have. Like there's ways of being honest, but also not sharing, every single piece of information, because in many professional situations, that's not appropriate.
Yeah. And one component that I've definitely noticed in myself that's progressed is there's this aspect of intellectual honesty or intellectual transparency or intellectual humility, where it's been so nice. I tend to refer to this as like the power of I don't know, which is not feeling that pressure of needing an answer for everything. And so that when my kids ask me things, it's like, it might be embarrassing that dad doesn't know this. Like geography is so embarrassing for me. Like it's been that way, and I've tried, and so that is just, I can honestly own, like, I don't know, let's go look that up. Or if it's something that when you're talking about death and dying and existential issues, what I can say is, well, here's what me and mom believe, right? This, by the way, is what Nana and Papa believe, and here's what other people believe too. What do you think about that, right? And that might not be age appropriate, but that there's differences of opinions, and that's totally fine. And the cool thing about doing research like you do, or, is not having the answers. And this is an ongoing conversation. So there's also the power of just, if we don't know, it's okay. We can own that, accept it, and hopefully learn from that as we're moving forward. But that definitely came to mind as you were talking about it. That's been a big shift.
I think you need a nice framed map for your living room or something. You can just easily point out locations, and then it's interesting, the I don't know, and that I think there's power in that, and also other situations where you can honestly share that I'm not willing or not able to disclose that at this time, which is different than I don't know.
Yep.
Again, I think about this a lot through negotiation, because that's another way people, I would say it's a lie when you know something and you say, I don't know. And that's another thing. People are asked a question that they're not authorized to disclose or they don't feel comfortable disclosing, depending on what it is. And so then a default, I don't know, and so one of the negotiation exercises, role plays I and many instructors use, there's a buyer and seller on a real estate transaction, and then the seller wants to know what the buyer is going to do with the property, and the buyer knows, but they don't think the other side is going to like it, and they're also not authorized to disclose that. And so sometimes, people will say, I don't know what they're going to do, which is a lie. And then, and if the person found out that you did know, and then you said, I don't know, I think, again, they still perceive it as a lie. I think that's very different kind of response than, I am not able to share that information at this time, which is honest. And so, again, being prepared for these kinds of questions, and, in any situation where we know we may be asked questions that we are not able to completely disclose, and thinking about how do we answer it in a way that helps the other person feel like we've been honest, that we've respected them, even if we're not telling them, the answer to that question. And I think part of this gets to what are the expectations that each party has for what is appropriate to disclose. And honesty, even though it does involve disclosure or some level, doesn't mean you have to disclose every belief you have, every thought. And I think there's a way to be honest and calibrate these expectations. Just because the person asked a question, you can still answer it in a way that is honest, but that doesn't necessarily require that you share things that would be inappropriate to share.
Yeah, and I think in your negotiation article, it was like having a job offer, right? Yeah, that can be a lot more powerful. Yeah, I do have one. Well, you don't need to disclose that, or if that's a lie and they found that out. So to your point, actually thinking this through before you're in that situation, if you can, how would we communicate this in a way that is truthful? But it's also, yeah, are there legal mandates? Are there ethical mandates? Or is it just, does it put you in a difficult position that you wouldn't be expected to disclose that thing? Well, there's almost an infinite number of ways you could communicate that. So taking your framework of honesty, thinking about this, fostering understanding. Again, I love that this is so complex because it opens up so many opportunities for how do we apply this, not just helping other people, but in our own lives. And it just seems like there's so much work left to be done. And I love that I get to chat with people like yourself who are at the forefront of this. It's really incredible.
Thank you.
Well, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you're particularly excited about, or you feel we'd be remiss by not chatting about?
I can share one current project related to this honesty framework that you might find interesting.
Yeah.
Or others might find interesting, is this work I'm doing with some law professors where we're studying about law students' beliefs about honesty. And what's interesting there, we were planning a 3-year study and we just collected data in the first year of law students. And one thing we've seen is comparing law students who are in the beginning of their program, right, orientation versus second or third years, is different beliefs about different aspects of honesty. And it reinforces this idea that there is complex. And so I think a lot of what lawyers are taught, law students, or even us as communicators, is this idea, to be honest, it's don't make false statements, right? Don't say so. And there's legal and ethical requirements there. But for lawyers, or with all of us, I think this aspect of disclosure and delivery, how we communicate, if you know the other side is under a misimpression, you didn't necessarily cause that misimpression, or there's been some mistake, maybe something's left out, a clause is left out of a contract. Should you disclose that to the other side? Should you correct the misimpression? And those, I think, are more challenging situations, whether for lawyers or also for people in business or other areas, where it's not about you actively making a false statement or not, but rather, do you correct other people's beliefs? And one thing we saw, at least with our initial data, that I think is fascinating is that comparing the first year students to the third years were less willing to make false statements. No one was very willing, but there was a different, but it was the opposite when it came to issues of disclosure, to correct omissions or things, where here you had the first year students saying they would be more willing or more likely to intend to disclose information compared to the third year students. And thinking about how these beliefs change over time is like, are we learning, the third year students are learning through the letter of the law where, they could technically get away with it, even if the legal requirement is to disclose. But this is the first study that I've seen where it's trying to look at things that affect these different elements of honesty. And that's something I'm interested in continuing to explore about these aspects of communication, disclosure, and delivery, of the ways in which we can be honest, which is much broader than just, does a person make a false statement or not? And how do we foster understanding? And so having the opportunity to study law students, and I could imagine extending this into other areas to figure out these nuances and what people think is the right thing to do, how might that change in different contexts or over time. And so, I'll know more in a few years as we continue to follow these students over time and contact them. But I thought this sort of initial findings were interesting in that honesty there, with the law students, where they're wrestling with these issues all the time about how they communicate, how they negotiate, what is your legal obligation, what is your ethical responsibility, and to the comment you made earlier, like, what kind of person do you want to be? And the end of the day, you have to live with yourself. And yeah, you could technically get away with not correcting this impression, that the other opposing counsel has, but what are the consequences for how you see yourself? What are the consequences for your reputation? And all of these decisions are much broader than sort of making false statements or not. Right? And to me, that's where we need to learn a lot more about these different aspects of honesty.
It's beautiful, and I'll be incredibly excited to see what that. But yeah, the change in this over time, and this also speaks to incentives, right? What are the norms in a particular field? Do you get penalized for doing this? Personal ethics versus, what is legal. There's so much complexity here, but again, that's what makes it so rich and, for me, so fascinating and just important. We can speak about it like on an individual basis, but this has society level, talking about AI and businesses, like this is existential and ethical, and just the implications are enormous. So again, it's incredibly fascinating and just a true honor and privilege to be able to talk with you today.
Thank you. And I love your show and listening to you and all your guests. I don't have a background at all in clinical psychology. And, so I love the lens you're bringing from some of your work and focused on honesty and other areas that touch on it. So thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome, Taya. Well, if before we end, for listeners who, they want to continue the conversation or, they want to find out more about you and your work, where would you point them to so they can find out more about you?
Yeah, so my Carnegie Mellon webpage, the first thing, my first name is Taya, Taya, Cohen, Cohen. There's not many Taya Cohens in the world, and maybe not any that I'm aware of. So if you Google my name, you can easily find my website, professional website and things, which people with more common names that don't have that luxury. But I think Tepper, tepper.cmu.edu/T Cohen is my CMU webpage. And on there's links to the lab that I co-run, the Collaboration and Conflict Research Lab that I run with my colleague, Lori Weingart, the Honesty Project website, other guests have spoken about that, and other links, including the Building an Ethical Future Forum, which was the conference we had, which also has a complete YouTube playlist of all the sessions and speakers where we had sessions on AI and ethics and about honesty and innovation, aligning your values with your career choice. We had a fascinating panel on that. So I would direct listeners to check out those videos. And yeah, thanks for having me.